The 2016 presidential campaign gets into real action. Rand Paul, who just beat Hillary Clinton in a respected Pennsylvania poll, announces his presidential candidacy. And before you sell this guy short, just watch how far and how fast he's moved. In 2010, he knocked out not only the establishment Republican candidate, Mitch McConnell's candidate, but beat the Democrat in November by a dozen points. He shellacked the guy. Now he's a genuine contender for the White House.
The words that he spoke were among the most powerful that I have seen in an announcement. I've done about 50 of these now, and this one's going to be in the top 3 or 4 based on the language that he used, and I know that we've got some dial clips coming up.
We sure do. I'm going to start with this one where he talked about taking our nation back. Watch.
We've come to take our country back from the special interests that use Washington as their personal piggy bank. The special interests that are more concerned with their personal welfare than the general welfare. The Washington machine that gobbles up our freedoms and invades every nook and cranny of our lives must be stopped.
Interesting there. What do you see? Because both of those dials really hanging together up top for a while.
Yes, even though this campaign is about Republicans, we wanted to see how swing Democrats also react, and that's the green line. You'll notice that both Republicans and Democrats responded incredibly favorably to the idea, not just of taking the country back, but beating up on the special interests and holding Washington accountable. It's one of the most effective lines of the campaign so far.
Okay, moving on to line number 2, where he talked about the debt and spending of money. Watch this.
We borrow $1 million a minute. This vast accumulation of debt threatens not just our economy, but our security. We can wake up now and do the right thing. Quit spending money we don't have. Yeah.
Okay, Frank, what's your analysis there?
Once again, and now he gave the perfect factoid, the spending per minute, and that's something that voters are going to understand. And then he connected it to, we cannot keep spending what we don't have. I'm going to tell viewers right now that people think the jobs are the #1 issue. Incorrect. Wasteful Washington spending and the debt and deficit are more important to more people, and Rand Paul's language is perfect there.
Yeah, indicated by those dials. In fact, finally, this up, foreign policy. This is Rand Paul on that.
I envision a national defense that promotes, as Reagan put it, peace through strength. I believe in applying Reagan's approach to foreign policy to the Iran issue. Successful negotiations with untrustworthy adversaries are only achieved from a position of strength.
I mean, that's almost off the chart, Frank, with both Democrats and Republicans.
And he did something smart here, because he's been accused of being an isolationist or not as engagement-oriented, but he talked about Reagan's approach, which is perfect for Republicans. He gave a balanced position, which works with swing Democrats. Now, he's got to be a little tougher. When he gets challenged on whether he's changed his positions, he gets a little bit defensive. But as you can see from those dial scores, it is incredibly effective. And if that's the approach that he takes during the campaign, he's going to be formidable, not just among 18 to 29-year-olds, but among Republicans overall.
I think that all of these issues that he talked about have tremendous resonance in some of these early states. And let's not forget, the motto of the state of New Hampshire is live free or die. So I think as I was watching this, I had one feeling going through, or one thought going through my head. It was that Rand Paul has achieved liftoff today. He's going to be a major, major player in the Republican nomination process. This event was beautifully staged. That speech was incredibly sophisticated. He touched all the buttons, and the notion that Rand Paul is running as a dove, I think, was refuted by this speech. Yeah. He articulated a conservative national defense vision, very consistent with Eisenhower and Reagan.
Let's talk about this. Is this fella a real contender as you look at the shape of the field right now?
Absolutely, Chris. I think he'll have his moment. Look, his foreign policy views, if you took things he has said on foreign policy and pulled them individually, it is hard to imagine that any of them would not be, you know, kind of over half in a primary electorate or nationally. He believes what I think a lot of ordinary people think. The problem is foreign policy in this country is crafted by elites in both parties and not by voters. So in Washington and think tanks and the State Department, it's very different. But it's hard for me to think of anything he said on foreign policy that your average voter is not going to kind of shake their head in agreement with.
Yeah, I'm so with you, and here's a poll to back up what you said. The grassroots regular Republicans are not as hawkish as the money people, the ones that make all the noise, including with Jeb Bush. Here, a recent Quinnipiac poll has Rand Paul in a close race in matchups with Hillary Clinton in some key swing states, the ones that matter. In Ohio, for example, Paul is within earshot. Actually, Clinton 41. He's 41, Clinton's 46.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And in Florida, he's within the margin of error, 43-46, down there against Hillary Clinton. In Pennsylvania, where I come from, he actually leads Clinton. Now, I want to go with Robert on that, Robert Costa. What that tells me is, despite all the hawkish neocon talk about we got to go into the latest war against Iran now, we'll talk about that in the next section, the average working guy and woman in Pennsylvania goes, wait a minute, that's us that has to do the fighting. Right. Our kids, we ain't going into another stupid war that people laugh at afterwards, and our kid comes home, beat up.
Senator Paul looks at what his father did in 2008, 2012. He sees someone who, in almost every primary, was in the top 3. So he starts with the base. The question is, how does he get number 1 or 2?
What's his percentage of the base? What's his percentage of the...
I'd say it's about 20%. That libertarian base, 20-25%. You add in some young voters. That's his coalition. At the moment, he needs to expand it.
Why has J.C. Watts of Oklahoma, an evangelical man of the South, why are you a Bible guy? Why are you with a libertarian guy like Rand Paul?
Well, Chris obviously has some libertarian leanings, but I think he has the right perspective, and I think he wants to do the right thing. And over the last 2.5 years that I've been talking to him, that I've had his ear, I think he's wanted to learn, and I think the things that he's done, he's not just taken on just your typical conservative issues on the social side and on the economic side, but he's gone much further than that, and he's gone into non-traditional constituencies. I think he's tried to be very consistent in striking up a dialogue with those non-traditional constituencies, and I think that's what we need. Post Jack Kemp, I've been looking for somebody that would offer up himself or herself to have this type of dialogue with more than a narrow constituency.
Well, the thing that I've been beating the drum on around here for a couple of years, JC, is the Republican Party's efforts at suppressing the vote. All these new requirements about photo IDs, and then some of these Republican leaders, like in Pennsylvania, just come out and say, yeah, we do it to suppress the otherwise vote. In fact, one guy said, well, keep the black vote down with it, in so many words. And yet this guy, you think is different. You believe is different.
Well, I've talked to the senator about this. He wants to expand ways that we can get more people to the polls to vote. And, the nonviolent offenders, we've had the conversation about that and saying that they should have the right to vote. And again, he's talked about things in the last 4 years that most conservatives would be afraid of getting voted off the island if they were talking about those type of things. And obviously he's made some mistakes. He's evolving, but I think he has honestly made the case to me that, JC, I want to have the right perspective. I want to learn. I want to go to the next, take the country to the next level in so many areas. And Chris, we're so focused on the 30,000-foot level on so many of these issues that we don't get down to that 300-foot level and have a dialogue, have a conversation, have deeper relationships. And I honestly think that he wants to do that.
Well, let me tell you why I like him, and you may disagree, because we have often disagreed, JC. I like him because he's not a hawk. He's not a neocon. He's not somebody who always wants to take us back to the Middle East, for the latest country we have to go to war with. He seems like a guy who has restraint in the use of military, just like he has restraint in the use of big government. What do you think of that?
Well, I will tell you this, Chris, my conversations with him, I don't think there's any question that his philosophy in terms of war is, if we're fighting a war, we win, they lose. That's the bottom line. However, I think he hasn't taken on a demeanor that says, let's shoot and then aim. And I think most people agree with that. And I think this ISIS thing is getting crazy. It's getting more crazy by the day, and in Kenya and in Nigeria and all over the Middle East. And it's something that we surely need to be concerned about, and I think he is. But the fact that he said, you know, as John Kennedy would say, you know, never fear to negotiate, but never negotiate out of fear. So I do think that now he's going to have to make that case to the American people, because you've got many people trying to frame who he is or what he believes in terms of our national security. But again, I think his philosophy, no question, is if we're going to do it, let's do it the right way. We win, they lose.
If he undermines the presumptive Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, and appeals to black and Latino voters, talking about mass incarceration, talking about unfairness in the criminal justice system, and talking about she's a hawk, and he's not, he becomes something that could be a real threat in a general election. So I think Rand Paul is a very interesting development.
He spoke to the National Urban League recently, talked about restoring voting rights to the non-violent criminals.
Oh, absolutely. I've been advocating that for years, and I think it gives him a lot of credibility. And that's why I think that if he's speaking to issues that the Democratic nominees or the Democratic candidates are not, it's kind of interesting. He spoke out on Ferguson.
Yeah.
And I think that Ron Paul might be something that will be the wild card that could really change the makeup of the race.
Yeah, Rand Paul, of course, being his dad.
Quinnipiac poll is out with a new poll this morning that shows actually Rand Paul is pulling ahead of Hillary Clinton in two critical swing states. In Colorado, this is surprising. Paul leads Senator Clinton, or Secretary Clinton, by 3 points, 44 to 41%. In Iowa,
brand new polling shows a big shift in the 2016 presidential race, with Senator Rand Paul up and Hillary Clinton down in some very critical swing states. After months and months of looking untouchable, things have changed for Hillary Clinton. The latest Quinnipiac swing state polls show the Democratic frontrunner's lead against the top Republicans is slipping. And perhaps more importantly, a plurality of voters in Colorado, Virginia, and Iowa, all critical states, now say the former Secretary of State is not honest and trustworthy. Some good news for the senator from Kentucky. The Quinnipiac swing state polls show the senator in a statistically dead heat now with Hillary Clinton.
From the CPAC straw poll, Senator Rand Paul wins the contest for the third time in a row, beating out a crowded field of potential 2016 GOP contenders.
One thing that people aren't measuring with Rand Paul is his outreach to the youth. And it's hard to measure youth voters because they vote so sporadically. So Rand Paul could ramp up things in Iowa that nobody would really see if he could really reach out to that new youth conservative vote and talk about issues that are very popular with them. I think that's one way to kind of catapult his candidacy that nobody's really talking about.
And Katrina, what do you think? How can he stand out from all of those others?
Well, aside from the youth, he's been doing something that not a lot of the other candidates have been doing, so that he's reaching out to minorities, particularly in the black community. I've commended him myself on some of the sentencing reform initiatives that he's pushing.
Well, he's going to offer the party an opportunity to have a candidate whose base is far broader than any Republican in modern times, because he does have an appeal to typically non-Republican constituencies, like young people and poor people and people that live in inner cities, African Americans who are concerned with reform of the criminal justice system, who are concerned with the concept of enterprise zones, that they might actually be entrepreneurs in a place like Detroit instead of fleeing from it. These are not typically Republican ideas. The area where, to go directly to your question, he will be divisive is in foreign policy, because there is this perception of him that he is the same as his father on foreign policy. He needs to demonstrate, and I think you'll hear that in a few minutes, that he's not the same as his father on foreign policy.
What's interesting about Rand Paul is that he is speaking to a country, including the Republican base, that is pretty suspicious about the use of American military power overseas. When people look at Iraq and Afghanistan, they don't really say, we want more of that. they say we're deeply skeptical about it. And I think that's a kind of wild card in this race. So, you know, Cruz will come back to the traditional muscular themes, beat the table, more of this. But will Rand Paul get some traction saying, well, now, wait a minute, is this really in our country's interest?
Rand Paul's pretty serious about this stuff, and I would say, having covered him a lot in Kentucky and nationally, he's pretty committed and he's pretty smart. And the other thing is, he's where the American people are right now. I don't know where the Republican...
Well, why are the Republican leaders like that?
The Republican leaders are locked into the past. I think that's basically it. It worked for them for a generation and a half.
It's a smart move.
It goes all the way back to the late 60s and the early 70s, and running against George McGovern and running against successive Democrats as weak on defense. They played that over and over and over again, even though Reagan was different. But don't forget, the polls show that most of the American people think the Iraq War was a mistake, that we wasted money and time.
Do the Republican money men think that?
I think increasingly they may. And don't forget that Hillary Clinton herself, who in many ways is more of a hawk than Rand Paul, has also now said, finally, that she thinks she made a mistake when she voted for the Iraq War. That shows that Rand Paul's headed in the right direction.
Some of your Republican critics argue that you are actually to the left of Hillary Clinton on foreign policy, that she's more hawkish than you are.
Yeah. Here's the interesting thing is, you know, who's aligned with President Obama, whose foreign policy is closest to President Obama. Interestingly, many of the hawks in my party line right up with President Obama. Think about the big issues we've had in the last couple years. The war that Hillary prominently promoted in Libya. Many of the hawks in my party were right there with her. Their only difference was in degrees. They wanted to go into Libya as well. They just always want boots on the ground. Some of the hawks in my party, you can't find a place on the globe they don't want boots on the ground.
But that's their point, that you're to the left of all that.
No, my point is that they are actually agreeing with Hillary Clinton and agreeing with President Obama that the war in Libya was a good idea. I'm not agreeing with either one of them. They're over here both for war. I'm over here saying that war made us less safe, that it made radical Islam or allowed radical Islam to rise up in Libya. There are now large segments of Libya that are pledging allegiance to ISIS, supplying arms to the Islamic rebels in the Syrian civil war. President Obama supported this, Hillary Clinton supported this, and so did the hawks in my party. Only they differed only on degrees. I didn't support the arming of the Syrian rebels because I felt like it would make al-Qaeda and ISIS worse. I didn't support the bombing of Assad. President Obama supported the bombing of Assad. So did the neocons in my party. So really, they're together in supporting many of these interventions, and I've been the one not supporting these interventions because I feared if you bombed Assad, you would allow ISIS to go stronger. There are 2 million Christians in Syria, and you know what? If you ask them who they would choose, they'd all choose Assad over ISIS because they see the barbarity of perhaps both, but they see the utter depravity and barbarity of ISIS. And so bombing Assad probably isn't a good policy. These are great foreign policy questions. There'll be great debates, and I look forward to having them.
You are described as an isolationist, but those close to you say, nope, he's really a realist. How do you see yourself?
You know what I think's funny about it is they're all saying, you've changed, you're no longer an isolationist, therefore you're on two sides of an issue. And all I've been saying for 5 years of public life is I'm not an isolationist. I look at every individual instance of whether or not we need to be involved. I look at it reluctantly. I don't want to be involved in war, but I do look and see when American interests are threatened. And I am like most Americans. I am influenced by the beheading of Americans, now the beheading of a British journalist. I think it's going to unite the world against ISIS. But I have steadfastly been against Hillary Clinton and President Obama's intervention in Libya as well in Syria, because I think they've helped to create the situation that we now face with ISIS.
Even though some argue that there had been an intervention in Syria might have prevented ISIS becoming what it is now.
They're absolutely wrong. For example, had we bombed Syria last year, had the president actually got what he wanted and what Hillary Clinton wanted and to bomb the heck out of Assad, my guess is ISIS would now be in Damascus. ISIS are the strongest fighters there,
they were not talking about
other than Assad.
The issue was not bombing. The issue was whether they should support the Free Syrian forces in Syria. And if they had supported them, they would have been less likely for ISIS to get as strong as it got.
Actually, Charlie, the issue was both bombing Assad and arming the rebels. We've been doing both at the behest of Hillary Clinton and President Obama. And I would say one insightful piece of news from the last week is some of the moderate rebels, so-called moderate rebels, have now signed a ceasefire with ISIS. So really, their enemy is really Assad, and they don't really care what ISIS does. And so they are the weakest fighting force there. It's a mistake to arm them. Most of the arms we've given to the so-called moderate rebels have wound up in the hands of ISIS because ISIS simply takes it from them or is given them, or we mistakenly actually give it to some of the radicals. So the intervention in Syria has created a safe haven for ISIS and has made our problem much more difficult. 5 years ago, ISIS wasn't a threat. But I did say, even as much as 2 or 3 years ago, that it was a threat to give arms to them in Syria. So I think had the president had his way, or had Hillary Clinton had her way, we may well have had ISIS in charge in Damascus now, because they've been arming and creating a safe haven for them. As it is, I think ISIS is more of a threat to us now because of the arming of the Islamic rebels in Syria.
Looking at the situation in Iraq as it is now, what would President Paul do?
I think we have to understand first how we got here, and then we have to decide as a country where we're going. I think there's chaos in the Middle East, and I think the chaos is because we've created a vacuum. Before the Iraq War, I think there was somewhat of a standoff between Sunni and Shiite, had been for maybe 1,000 years off and on. But now we have a chaotic situation, we have a vacuum, and I think one of the reasons why ISIS has been emboldened is because we've been arming their allies. We have been allied with ISIS in Syria. They have had a safe haven because we have been arming the rebels to keep Assad away from them, and now they go back and forth. So I think our intervention in Syria has led precisely to what's
it may
going on in
have,
Iraq.
Senator, but when one's sitting in the Oval Office, you have to think, what do we do now? So would President Paul at this moment send U.S. advisors and say, go and see what we can do to help the Iraqi army? Would a President Paul say, I might do airstrikes?
I think the first thing you'd have to do is follow the Constitution. The Constitution says that Congress decides. The president doesn't have the unilateral authority to begin war.
But do you think it's a good idea?
Well, here's what I would say is this is an incredibly important point. The Reagan doctrine for how we go to war is that you should have a consensus of the people. So there needs to be a full-throated debate in Congress, and Congress has to decide. Militarily, we could go back in. You know, the surge worked. Obviously, we have the military might and power, but the country as a whole has to decide, do we want to send 100,000 troops in, or are we willing to have 4,500 young Americans die to save a city like Mosul that the Shiites won't even save, that they've fled?
What does Rand Paul think at this point?
No ground troops. I think that we need to see...
And I think most everybody agrees. How about airstrikes?
I think we need to see what the Shiites will do to defend themselves. If the Shiites are not willing to fight for their country, it may be that their country is not going to exist.
No, because by the time you hold a plebiscite and find out how people feel about Iraq, by the time you get Congress to do anything, it's 2 weeks later, and the ISIS is sitting in Baghdad.
Right.
So you're going to have to move pretty quickly here, but you're against airstrikes.
There are times when a president would move quickly to dispel an imminent threat to our country. But where I disagree with the president is his theory in Libya was that there was an imminent threat to Benghazi. That's not what an imminent threat is. It's an imminent threat to our country. And so what I would say is that the Shiites who are ripping their uniforms off and running need to stand up and fight. And could we assist them in some way? I'm not ruling that out. But I would first wait to see, are the Shiites going to fight for their country or not?
You are calling for a formal declaration of war against ISIS. Why?
You know, our founding fathers were very clear that you don't go to war without the authority of Congress. In fact, I think the most important responsibility we have in serving in Congress is to deliberate over going to war. I can't think of anything more important, and the president's basically doing it on his own. Now, this isn't the first thing the president's decided to go on his own, but this is pretty important, and so we've introduced a declaration of war which would give the constitutional imprimatur to going to war. He should have done it 5 months ago, but even now we're going to try to force him to live by the rules of Congress.
All right, the Constitution says that the Congress has the authority to declare war. That's clear. It's Article 1, Section 8. The president claims that he has authority under two things. One is the 2001 authorization passed after the 9/11 attacks that President Bush used, and the 2002 authorization sought by President George Bush for the Iraq War, that he says that he's doing it lawfully under those two.
Both of those, I'd say, would be absurd contentions. Basically, in 2001, we voted for an authorization that said the people who attacked us on 9/11, that we would go after them. Well, this group wasn't in existence then, and this group isn't even allied with al-Qaeda. This group is at odds with al-Qaeda. So I think it's absurd. I told John Kerry that when he came before our committee. That's absurd to try to say a linkage to a war started 15 years ago against the people who attacked us on 9/11. Now, I am for doing something against ISIS. I just think we ought to do the right thing constitutionally and vote on it. My declaration of war also limits this in the sense that I don't want ground troops back there. I think the troops on the ground ought to be the people who live there. And it also says that within 1 year it expires, so we would have to vote again. I don't want perpetual war, and that's what we've had for the last 15 years is war without end. I think the war would have to be renewed if we want to go on beyond a year.
Is President Obama acting unlawfully now if you say that those two prior provisions are ridiculous or don't apply?
Yes, absolutely. I think he has no statutory authority and no constitutional authority. The Constitution, I think, would allow, and most people say, for the repelling of an imminent attack. But once an attack goes on for months and months and you're actually not defending anything, you're actually going out and offensively trying to either conquer territory or conquer an opponent, I don't think that's a defensive maneuver, nor is that temporary or an imminent attack. That is something that ought to be contemplated by Congress.
What did Secretary Kerry say?
He said, which I think is absurd, he said, well, yeah, if 2001 doesn't do it, the president has Article 2 authority to do whatever he wants. I disagree with that. I think most constitutional scholars do. And I think most people in the American public do not think the president has unlimited power to go to war.
What's the appetite among your colleagues in the U.S. Senate? Do you have any Democrats, first of all?
It's actually something that actually doesn't split neatly along party lines. I would say there's as many Democrats as Republicans, or probably more Democrats than Republicans that actually agree with me on this. Republicans are good if it has to do with immigration or Obamacare. They say, oh, the president can't do things by himself. But when it comes to war, some Republicans will say, oh, no, the president, no matter who he is, can do whatever he wants. So some Republicans agree with John Kerry. Unlimited power to the presidency for war. I think in every area, immigration, Obamacare, and war, that the Constitution limited the president's powers.
Well, it's sort of interesting. There's been sort of a slippery slope with the Constitution over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years. I mean, you and I think probably agree that the NSA should get a warrant if it's going to seize records. I mean, people are sort of thinking that the Constitution is just some sort of silly piece of paper.
Yeah, and it's amazing that these things were written over 200 years ago, and still they apply to today. You know, the Fourth Amendment on making sure your records were secure was written because they didn't like the British soldiers having general warrants with nobody's name on it and going into your house and taking your papers. And so we really try to prevent this from happening, and it still applies today. The only difference is your papers are somehow digitalized, and sometimes other people hold your papers for you. But I don't think you relinquish a privacy interest if I let the phone company hold my records. I think those are still mine. They can't share them with my neighbor, so they shouldn't share them with the government.
All right, let me turn to a trip that you took about a month ago to Ferguson, Missouri. Why did you go?
Because I think that I wanted to further understand what's going on, not just in Ferguson, but in a lot of our major cities. What I sense is there's sort of an undercurrent of unease out there, that people are unhappy because of poverty, they're unhappy because of unemployment, but they're also unhappy because criminal justice system, I think, seems to have trapped people, particularly people of color. African Americans, Hispanics are disproportionately represented in our prisons for nonviolent drug crimes. And I think because of that, there's this sense of, you know, I'm not being treated fairly. There's a sense of anger. You see what's going on, and none of it do I condone any of what's going on in Ferguson, the violence. In fact, I was there. I suggested put out a voter registration table. I'll come help you man the table because I want more people to vote. And I think it's a way of getting people to participate. But at the same time, there is an anger out there, and we ought to understand what the anger is about. Doesn't mean we condone it, but we need to understand, is there a way to make our legal system better? A good example is in Ferguson last year, there were $2 million in petty fines. For you or I, a $100 fine might not be a big deal, but if you're poor and you have a $100 fine, then you don't pay it, and then next week it's $125, then it's $150, then it's $200. You can see how these petty fines build up, and there's an anger build up towards authorities because they're getting nickeled and dimed to death by these petty fines.
You are working with Senator Cory Booker, a Democrat from New Jersey, on reestablishing federal voting rights to nonviolent felons who have served parole and et cetera. What of all the issues facing Congress at this point, what draws you to that? Is this about Republican inroads into minority communities?
As I've traveled about the country and within my state talking to people, I found a number of people. In fact, as I've explored the issue, there's nearly 1 million people in our country who have lost their voting rights. In Kentucky, you lose your voting rights forever. I have a friend whose brother grew marijuana plants 30 years ago in college, has a felony conviction, and still cannot vote 30 years ago. I think that's wrong and unfair. Republicans, I think, have been unfairly tarred as, trying to suppress vote. Here's a Republican who wants to enhance the vote. This is a much bigger problem than anything else limiting voting right now. Nearly 1 million people can't vote, and I want to help people get their right to vote back.
And as we know, African Americans, percentage-wise, certainly make up a larger percentage of folks being incarcerated. I think the NAACP has estimated about 1/3 of young black males are in jail. Is this a way for the Republican Party to begin outreach, which they have said for decades they needed to do, into minority communities?
Well, I think it's both. I believe in the issue, but you're right. It is opening the door for me to talk to communities. 3 out of 4 people in prison are black or brown for nonviolent drug use. However, when you do surveys, white kids are doing drugs at an equal rate, and they're a much bigger part of the population. So why are the prisons full of black and brown kids? It's easier to arrest them. It's easier to convict them. They don't get as good at attorneys. And frankly, they live in the city in a much more collected fashion than in the suburbs. And so the police are patrolling the city more. But it is unfair. The war on drugs has had a racial outcome unintentionally, but it has a racial outcome, and I want to try to fix it.
And we should say your bill, in fact, does change some drug laws in order to try to even out the punishment for similar drugs.
Let's talk about your campaign. You have been reaching out to black voters, to millennials. You have said that the 1.1 million immigrants in this country already here should have some legal status and pay taxes. If I didn't know better, and I do know better, I would think you might be a Democrat. Do you really think you can get the Republican nomination making those statements and taking those positions?
Well, you add that to the fact that I'm also one of the most conservative members of the Senate, in the sense that I vote against spending, I vote against unbalanced budgets, I'm a proponent of lower taxes, so all of those are right within the mainstream of the party. But I do have some additional things, I call them sometimes the libertarian-ish kind of issues of believing in privacy, believing in criminal justice, that everyone should be treated fairly under the law no matter the color of your skin. We still have a large problem in our country that if you are black, you're not always being treated fairly under the law, and I want to fix that.
I did say 1.1 million. I think I meant 11 million immigrants, but you want to find some sort of legal status for them.
What I want to do is first secure the border. If we secure the border and we can say we know who's coming, who's going, and only people come legally, the 11 million that are here, I think there could be a work status for them. And I think what I've tried to say is what we want is more legal immigration so we have less illegal immigration. But I am open to immigration reform. I voted against the bill that came forward, though, primarily because it limited the number of legal work visas.
Do you think there are some in the Republican Party who are not as interested in becoming more inclusive than you are? And I say that because, after all, when the Republican Party became dominant across the South, it was right after the 1965 Civil Rights Law was passed.
I like to remember farther back in like 1928 when 2/3 of the African American population voted Republican. It switched a lot in 32, but you're right, it kept dwindling, and we have not tried very hard. But I have been going. I've been to Ferguson, I've been to Detroit, I've been to Chicago, I've been to Milwaukee, I've been to a lot of our nation's bigger cities, and I've tried to say to the African American population, 1, I'm going to fix the criminal justice system. 2, I believe in your privacy. And 3, I believe in economic opportunity. I'm for a $1 billion tax cut for Detroit to try to help them bail themselves out.
Do you want to be defined within your party as a different kind of Republican? Because you have suggested to some Iowans that perhaps the party was obsessing on such issues as same-sex marriage, which you had a very strong moral view on, but should not be obsessed.
Yeah, I do want to be a different kind of Republican in the sense that I want to reach out to new people we haven't been reaching out to. I frankly think that we are the party of voting rights, we are the party of the Bill of Rights, we are the party of emancipation, that we really should be the party that's reaching out to the African American public and saying, hey, give us another chance, take a look at us. Many of the libertarian issues of saying, you know what, your government should always allow you to have a trial, to have a lawyer, these are things that are very important if you've ever been any kind of minority, whether it's an ideological one or a racial one, that we need protections against an overzealous government. And I think some of these arguments actually will resonate once we take them to new communities.
He has already visited some places, Alex, that you wouldn't normally expect a Republican presidential candidate to go.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I followed him. I covered him when he went out to Berkeley, for example, and talked to a bunch of liberal students out there. He's gone to some historically black colleges. He was at Bowie State. I was out there with him, too. Rand Paul, on the other hand, he keeps emphasizing he's a different kind of Republican. And so he's going to be trying not only to get the base, he's going after D.C. hard and trying to, definitely go after that Tea Party vote, but he's going to try to attract, like we said, people that aren't usually attracted to the Republican Party, minorities, young people, and that sort of thing. So I think we're going to see a big emphasis on that.
The interesting thing we've seen is that in the last couple of weeks, we're outpolling Hillary Clinton in Iowa, which is a purple state, Pennsylvania, which is a purple state, and also in Colorado. So I think we're doing something right to attract independents and women because we're outpolling her in these bellwether states that could go either way.
Could Rand Paul win a presidential
But he's running as a Republican. Yeah, I think he could win. I hope he'll be the nominee.
Do you call him a libertarian? Do you think he is more of a libertarian than a Republican?
Yeah, more than the other guys. Definitely.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.